Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dave Deptula, AFA's Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. And I'd like to welcome you all to our first web version of our Nuclear Deterrence Breakfast Series. We're very pleased to have with us today Mr. Frank Miller. Now, most of you know Mr. Miller, but for those of you who don't, he served 31 years in the U.S. government, including 22 years in the Department of Defense, serving under 7 secretaries in a series of several progressively senior positions, and also served as 4 years as a special assistant to President George W. Bush and Senior Director for Defense Policy and Arms Control on the National Security Council staff. Frank's currently a principal at the Scrowcroft Group. So Frank, welcome, and thanks very much for joining us today. To start off, how about giving us an overview of your thoughts on the state of U.S. nuclear modernization, the New START extension, or the possibility thereof, and some of the arms control initiatives that are floating around out there?
Thanks, Dave. It's a pleasure to do this. And I think maybe the best thing to do, given some recent developments, is that I focus on some of the attacks being made by the U.S. disarmament community on the modernization program. And then we can get into the specifics of New START and other agreements as we go to questions and answers. So let me jump in and start with the phrase that's never let a good crisis go to waste. It's been popularized by Rahm Emanuel, but I guess it originally was attributed to Stanford economist Paul Romer. But it certainly has been fully embraced by the Washington-centric disarmament community in the United States. And recent reports, notably by the Arms Control Association, but even one foolish article on the Hill published in The Hill today, now raise, I quote, the rising human and financial toll, close quote, of dealing with the coronavirus crisis. And they use that as a reason to back away from modernizing U.S. nuclear forces. And they surround this call with a body of lies and falsehoods, and I use those words designedly, which they want to use to sway public opinion, but which in reality are the same lines they've been taking for years, coronavirus or no. Consider the following lines, and I'm going to quote here, quote, the projected cost to sustain and upgrade the U.S. nuclear arsenal continues to grow and grow and grow some more, close quote. Or the U.S. modernization program, quote, will grow the size of the U.S. nuclear stockpile. Or, quote, the factors driving the NNSA budget growth are unclear, end quote. Or there's no historical precedent for the NNSA plan to produce 80 pits a year. Or, quote, the administration inherited a larger and more diverse nuclear arsenal than is required for deterrence, close quote. And finally, quote, the current approach relies on nuclear warfighting and de-emphasizes stability and survivability, close quote. Now, this alarmist nonsense would draw knowing smiles of disbelief if it originated in Moscow or Beijing. And at least the Russians and the Chinese know that they're playing a propaganda game. But sadly, instead it comes from a group of people who have never felt the burden of public responsibility and public office in defense of this nation and our allies, who have never managed or been inside an industrial enterprise, and who use partisan lenses and rhetoric to obscure or ignore basic facts. So what's their answer to this problem? Well, the answer is they want to cut the Columbia class from a minimum of 12 boats to 10. They want to extend the life of the Minuteman force and cut the number of ICBMs to 300. They want to give up the LRSO program. They want to scale back plans to modernize warheads for the submarine-launched and ICBM forces. And they want to forego the ability to produce new pits. So let's examine each of these flawed assertions and then turn to their shop-worn and dangerous recommendations. First, the projected cost of the modernization program as a percentage of the defense budget is not growing. The 2018 NPR said that the cost of the effort to operate the current force and to replace aging systems with new ones would be between 6 to 7% of the defense budget. And even the Arms Control Association's own charts indicate that that remains true, between 6 to 7% of the defense budget. However, if the charge is that the overall cost of each program is growing, The proper response, to quote the sage Homer Simpson, is duh. As programs move from early R&D to advanced R&D to low-rate initial production and on to full production, costs go up. That's a fact. That's how manufacturing works. There should be no surprise here that the cost is still within the 6 to 7% of the defense budget. Third, you can search the 2018 NPR from cover to cover without finding any policy which supports expanding the US nuclear warhead stockpile. The only point where the size of the stockpile is even addressed concerns the introduction of the small number of low-yield Trident W76-2 warheads, in which case the NPR is absolutely explicit that this will come at the expense of existing warheads. Fourth, there should be no cause for uncertainty about the crying need for increased funding for NNSA. Study after study, press report after press report, has made clear that many of the facilities which support the nuclear warhead programs are well past their design life. NNSA Administrator Lisa Gordon-Haggerty recently put it this way, and I quote, "More than 50% of NNSA's facilities throughout the NNSA complex are more than 40 years old, and 30% of them were built in the Manhattan Project era," close quote. And unlike those who work in the Arms Control Association spaces, many NNSA employees today work in places where netting is strung from the ceiling to catch falling pieces of concrete. Fifth, a simple look at another disarmament website, that of the Federation of Atomic Scientists, indicates that during the Cold War, the US built hundreds, and in some cases thousands, of new nuclear warheads every year, each with new pits. So the comment that building 80 pits a year is unprecedented just doesn't even work within their own circles. It's also absurd in the extreme for the disarmers to argue that the size of the current arsenal is more than is required for deterrence. Dave, you and I have been through this on the inside for decades. But the Arms Control Association has no knowledge of this. They can only mirror image their own value systems on Putin and Xi Jinping, which is a fundamental mistake of the first order. The only other explanation is that they desire that the US adopt a minimum deterrence policy, in which case they should advocate that and defend it in public. Successive American administrations, both Democrat and Republican, have rejected minimum deterrence. But if that's what the Arms Control Association wants, let's have that debate rather than engaging in phony attacks on a topic on which they are unschooled and ignorant. And finally, there is that old canard, the ever-popular bloody flag, that US policy is based on nuclear warfighting, not on deterrence. To one who's been in the business a very long time, that remark is as insulting as it is totally false. Read the 2018 NPR. It speaks to deterrence. It speaks to deterring potential enemies whose force posture and exercises suggest nuclear warfighting. It speaks to raising the threshold for nuclear use, not warfighting. So let's turn to their proposed solutions. First, the idea that the size of the Columbia class, the future backbone of our deterrent, should be cut betrays either complete dishonesty, and there's a lot of that in their pitch, or total ignorance of industrial reality. Cutting boats 11 and 12, and possibly 13 and 14, won't solve the fiscal problem the ACA has raised with regard to coronavirus. Delaying boats 1 and 2 now will be hugely damaging to Electric Boat's efforts to prepare for building the new SSBNs. The investment in a new construction hall and in the training and hiring of new skilled workers is not something you can stop or start on a whim. And if you did, in addition to causing more economic hardship at a time when jobs are important, you would end up adding additional costs to the program in the future. Reality is going to beat errant ideology every time. Second, as you know very well, Dave, the idea of extending the Minuteman force has been studied and studied and studied. You just can't do this safely. If the ACA wants to eliminate the ICBM force, let it argue that case. But don't hide behind phony engineering, and don't create force structure cuts from 400 to 300, which have no basis in policy or military operations. And by the way, since the bomber force no longer stands day-to-day alert, eliminating the ICBM force essentially reduces our strategic posture to a monad. Third, speaking of the bomber force, eliminating the LRSO also eliminates the B-52's nuclear role, removing, therefore, in the near term, upwards of 600 or more weapons from the force. The absurd notion that nuclear-tipped cruise missiles are uniquely destabilizing is a notion unique to American disarmers. It certainly doesn't translate into Russian or Chinese, since both countries deploy modern nuclear air-launched cruise missile systems. And abandoning the LRSO will also condemn the B-21 to fly directly into advanced enemy defenses in the decades to come, which is surely an extraordinarily unsound approach to maintaining a viable bomber leg. And finally, calling for a halt to upgrading U.S. ballistic missile warheads and abandoning the ability to build new nuclear pits reveals a gross ignorance of what we have learned through decades of the stockpile surveillance program. Nuclear warheads age. They develop flaws and cracks. They cannot last forever. If they are not replaced at some point, they will become unreliable. If they become unreliable, they will have to be removed from service. If there is no replacement, we will have backed into unilateral disarmament. So I'd like to close these opening remarks by leaving you with a quote from Ash Carter, President Obama's last Secretary of Defense. Here's what Carter had to say in 2017, a point in time when he could say whatever he wanted to and didn't have to follow anyone's policy. I quote, "The Defense Department cannot further defer recapitalizing Cold War era systems if we are to maintain a safe, secure, and effective nuclear force that will continue to deter potential adversaries that are making improvements in their air defenses and their own nuclear weapons systems. The choice is not between replacing these platforms or keeping them, but rather between replacing them and losing them altogether. The latter outcome would unfortunately result in lost confidence in our ability to deter. The United States cannot afford this in today's security environment or in any reasonably foreseeable future security environment." End quote. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to everybody's questions.
Well, thanks very much for that insight, Frank. I think it's extraordinary in terms of the way you condensed a lot of these issues in a short couple of minutes. But let's dig into the topic a bit more with some questions from our series sponsors. According to the President's fiscal year 2021 budget request, the Department of Defense's budget top line is going to remain relatively flat. We all know that. And that was before the U.S. financial outlook changed with this whole impact of COVID-19. What do you believe pragmatically are the potential implications for U.S. nuclear modernization plans in light of this emerging fiscal environment?
That's a great question. And I know, and you know, there will be a push from many on the Hill to cut the nuclear modernization program. But I think there are two problems with this. The first problem is that if we had not deferred modernizing the legs of the triad as long as we have, we could have done each leg differently, you know, in a concurrent or serial fashion. But we didn't. We didn't do that. We deferred modernizing the triad until we came to the point where everything had to be done at the same time, to include nuclear command and control, oh, by the way. So, as I said in my opening remarks, you have to do that. Or as Ash Carter said, the systems are going to go away. My second point would be that in an era of great power competition, you know, and that's the great power competition, pure competitor, those are politically correct words for describing potential enemies. To be clear, the nuclear deterrent is the bedrock of our ability to deter conventional conflict. That's not my view. I mean, it's been the view of the Department of Defense. General Milley, when he was chief of staff of the Army, for goodness sakes, who had no stake in nuclear missions, told the Congress that back in I think 2017. The nuclear force is fundamental to conventional deterrence. And so for those who say, let's do another tank battalion and cut the nuclear forces, I think that's fundamentally unsound. So yeah, we're going to have that argument. There's no question in my mind. But I do believe that we need to stick with the nuclear modernization program as much as we can.
Well, thanks for that. I would suggest that the point that you made of the interrelationship between conventional deterrence and nuclear deterrence needs to be increased as we move forward in refining our strategies against particularly the Chinese, because too often folks in that theater, well, I'll just leave it at that. I'll just leave it at the importance of making sure that the nuclear piece is fundamental to our conventional deterrent as well as engagement strategies. Now, speaking of the Russians and the Chinese, their air and missile defense systems are increasingly capable against our legacy weapons, including our nuclear forces. So what changes or improvements are necessary to ensure U.S. nuclear forces are able to successfully perform their missions?
Well, again, I think the modernization program has that pretty well covered in the sense that with the bomber force, we are increasing the stealth capability of the bomber force. I mean, we're into next generation systems beyond what the B-2 can do. But we also have to have the standoff, both for the B-52 force, which is still a workhorse of the deterrent and will be for quite some time, and for the B-2 as it faces air defenses in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And people forget, I mean, I was just reading this silly article published in The Hill today by this retired Army colonel who makes clear that, the Army hasn't thought about nuclear weapons in 30 years, who says, well, the Joint Chiefs agreed in the Obama period that you could go to 1,000 nuclear weapons. Well, first of all, that was a different time. But second of all, he conveniently drops the caveat the chiefs very clearly put on the table, and which General Bob Kaler, retired, emphasizes time and time again. That included the bomber counting rule. That included having cruise missiles on B-52s and other weapons, so that those didn't really count in the overall start total. So you have to have advanced cruise missile systems and advanced bomber systems to penetrate enemy air defenses. As far as survivability against other kinds of enemy defenses, the Columbia class is going to be the stealthiest submarine in the world. And I think that those developments will enable the submarine force to stay hidden. An ICBM that has a better command and control system, that is more capable of being launched promptly, if it has to be, provides an adequate deterrent. And the new warheads, I think, regardless of what defenses exist, the new warheads have to allow us to have increased confidence in our own system. So by and large, I think the strategic modernization program as it exists is a positive way forward. I think we can cope with enemy developments that way.
Very good. Speaking of the future, maybe a little bit closer than what you've been immediately discussing, if we see a change in administration in November and potentially a change in the makeup of the Senate, do you expect any significant changes to U.S. nuclear policy or our U.S. nuclear force modernization plans?
Well, I don't want to get myself in more trouble than I'm already in, but I mean, sure. Former Vice President Biden, in a recent article in Foreign Affairs where he described his vision of a national security policy, on the last page of that article, returned once again to his idea that the United States needs to move to a no first use of nuclear weapons policy. He said he said in consultation with allies and with the military leadership, but this is a theme that he's had for many years. So that would be a significant change in U.S. nuclear policy. Also, we know that from the first couple of years of the Obama administration, there was great reluctance to modernizing the strategic forces. And you still find some veterans of those early years opposing any modernization at all. So I think that it'll be a tougher fight. On the other hand, the strategic situation has changed so dramatically since 2009, 2010, with the complete rebuilding of Russia's strategic forces, its shorter range nuclear forces, and its unconventional exotic nuclear forces like the transoceanic torpedo, that I would think that that would change some people's thinking from the old days. And similarly, China is building up its nuclear forces. I don't know whether they're going to double the force as some people suggest or not, but the world has changed dramatically, and decisions need to be made in light of those changes.
Current Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, Mike Griffin, testified before Congress that the United States currently cannot defend against adversary hypersonic weapons. Be that as it may, this could leave our nuclear bomber bases and ICBM fields increasingly vulnerable to disarming a strike. So what impact, if any, might this have on the nuclear triad's viability in the future? And what should DoD do to counter this growing threat to our nuclear forces?
Well, I guess I'll get in trouble with Mike Griffin on this one. Back when I was younger, back in the 80s and in the 90s, you and I were always dealing with concerns about cruise missile defense, and Soviet submarines and Soviet aircraft with cruise missiles. We never found a coherent, comprehensive, leak-proof way to deal with that kind of a threat. Similarly, our capability to deal with ballistic missile defense is only geared towards rogue countries. I'm not aware of any technologies at this point which are easily achievable at acceptable cost, which can defend against enemy hypersonic cruise missiles. The threat of decapitation to Washington is always there. There are procedures to maintain the continuity of government in the event of a surprise decapitation attack, but that, again, everything is contextual. It's extraordinarily unlikely that there'd be a decapitation attack out of the clear blue sky. And if we were involved in some sort of a conflict or a war, steps would have been taken to posture the president in a position where decapitation was more difficult, much harder for an enemy to count on achieving. And then there's the EMP threat, which others have talked about for a long time, which is another kind of a decapitation or preemptive strike. So I understand all of that. And I hope that somebody's got a bright, shiny object that allows us to defend against enemy hypersonics. But I'm not confident that we're there. And rather than put money against those kinds of things, I'd rather make sure in the context of the conversation we're having on the last question, that we have to devote our money to keeping the strategic modernization program on track and to presenting a very strong offensive deterrent to potential enemy leaders.
Well, I don't think Mike could be that upset with you, Frank. I think that's a reasonable perspective that folks would understand. As we clearly need to build the kinds of capabilities that get us to the point where we can defend against hypersonics, but on the other hand, by themselves, there are not enough simply to negate the well-established capabilities of a nuclear triad.
Could I jump in one more second?
Absolutely, you bet.
About hypersonics, I recently published a piece in Real Clear Defense. I really think the United States needs to move out rapidly, more rapidly than we're doing, on our own conventional hypersonic systems. In my piece, I focused on the Navy systems, but if you look at American defense concerns over the last decade, we've been talking a lot about A2AD up in the Baltics and in the South China Sea. And those defenses need to be offset. If the United States is going to continue to operate in those regions to provide a deterrent shield for our allies, in a war, those defenses would have to be suppressed. And I think that the hypersonic systems, which the Navy and Army are developing together, provide the answer to that. What has to be done, however, is you have to put those things into production more quickly than they're currently being done. And you have to deploy them widely, so you have a lot of systems always on station, able to do what you have to do. Nothing would be better than to increase the number of Virginia-class submarines and Virginia payload modules that carry these things. I mean, I envision this to be something like the deployment of the Tomahawk system in the 80s, dispersed throughout the fleet, proliferated throughout the Atlantic fleet, the Pacific fleet, so that we have the capability to fight our way in if we have to help defend our allies.
Well, actually, we're going to have next week Dr. Mark Lewis, who works for Mike Griffin and who is right in the middle of this discussion space. So it'll be interesting to hear his perspectives on this topic as well. Let's move back to arms control. Arms control tends to focus on U.S.-Russian negotiations. However, China has begun a nuclear modernization program of its own, which you mentioned, and you've pointed out has prompted a reconsideration of China's traditional strategy of minimal deterrence. How might a shift in China's nuclear posture impact the security environment in the Pacific?
Well, if China moves to a more aggressive nuclear posture, it just means that we have to have a stronger deterrent. Again, I mean, our missile defenses are not geared towards Russia or China, and even a minimum deterrent force for China, which resulted in the deaths of tens or hundreds of millions of Americans, would be devastating to our country. So what we have to do, of course, is to prevent the war from occurring in the first place. The only worry I would have, not that I want to see the Chinese build up their forces, but the only worry I would have is if China continues to modernize its force and we do not carry through the strategic modernization program. A strong deterrent is key to maintaining peace and security in the Pacific. And, you know, China's power this also entails back to the Navy hypersonic system. China's building its power projection capabilities. It has been pretty aggressive in trying to assert its sovereignty over the entire South China Sea. Our allies in the region are not keen on that at all. And so we need to maintain the ability to operate our conventional forces backed by a nuclear shield in that part of the world, or else China will exert undue influence over the political and economic structures of our allies.
Okay, you also stated that the prospects for trilateral arms control between the United States, Russia, and China are pretty slim. What steps could the U.S. take to improve the chances of China participating in future arms control talks?
I think the best thing that we can do with respect to China is to continue. I say continue. We need to start in a major way, exposing to the world all of the things that China does. You know, not to beat someone when they're down. The whole COVID situation shows how the Chinese government suppresses information and views transparency as a weakness, not as a strength. China has never been clear about its nuclear forces. It doesn't even publish data on its nuclear forces. The Chinese no first use policy is a bit of a sham, because when you explore what the Chinese really say, no first use can be invoked if the Chinese government believes it's subject to attack. And so a preemptive use of a nuclear weapon is still consistent with no first use. That's their view. In our view, that's not no first use. So China has never been transparent about anything in its military capabilities, and now we find out about in its health situation. Getting China to be transparent will take a long, long time. And okay, I mean, maybe that will happen at some point, but I do not see the Chinese allowing us onto their territory to count warheads and inspect systems. And therefore, I'm not optimistic until maybe this generation of Chinese leaders change, that there's going to be any real prospect for arms control with China now.
Frank, if I may, one of the things as you're talking there that strikes me is that people in the United States and around the free world simply do not understand the difference in our operating systems. The control that the Communist Chinese Party has over its people is something that is simply unimaginable in the United States. So it's an excellent point. And I think if there's really nothing good that comes out of COVID-19, but the fact that this is happening is illustrating the points that you're making, and people are beginning to wake up and understand that there is no transparency, and there is great information control in these countries.
It points once again to the incredible value of a free press. You know, you're finding out that now that there are dribs and drabs of information trickling out, that Putin is suppressing information on what's going on within Russia with respect to COVID. We know what the Chinese government does, not only with respect to COVID, but with controlling information generally. You're absolutely on point with that. That those societies do not operate the way we in the Western democracies operate. And to assert that they do, or to assume that they do, and to treat them as equals in that sense is just completely wrong.
Well, let's turn to the INF Treaty. The U.S. withdrawal from that treaty was effectively just an acknowledgement that Russia's continued deployment of SSC-8s rendered the treaty null and void. Mm-hmm. What are the strategic and operational implications of a post-INF world now that the U.S. has stopped its policy of unilateral restraint? And what should the Department of Defense do to counter the advantages the Russians may have gained by violating the treaty?
Well, great question again. As you said, the Russian violations of the treaty rendered it null and void. And for the United States to continue to adhere to a treaty that the Russians were violating is not arms control, that's unilateral restraint. The larger question, I think, is what military advantage, or for what military purpose did the Russians do that? And what do we need to do in response? My guess, and I'm just guessing now, and I've not discussed this with anybody on a classified basis, of course. My guess is that the Russians decided that they didn't have enough strategic weapons to cover China, the United States, and Europe, and so they needed to break the treaty to give themselves some additional weapons. And in that sense, New START has constrained them. The flip side of that is, do we have, or are we short in our targeting requirements, particularly in theater-based systems against Russia or China? My own argument would be no. There's nothing I've seen that suggests that we're short in our targeting capabilities. The larger political context, which the Russians keep trying to excite with our NATO allies, is, do we want another debate with our NATO allies about stationing new nuclear weapon systems in NATO? That would really divide the alliance. And every week you still see an article from the Russian government in RT or Sputnik that says, hey, Europeans, you got to be careful because the Americans are getting ready to deploy new nuclear systems on your soil. Well, that's nonsense. So I don't see, just because the Russians went out and violated the treaty, I don't see a military need or a deterrent need for us to counter in kind. What I do see a need to do is as we were talking earlier, we need to proceed ahead with the long-range hypervelocity systems, which allow us to increase our conventional capabilities in the theater, particularly in the Pacific. Now, actually, those systems are not constrained, would not be constrained by the INF Treaty. So I think it was extraordinarily unfortunate that that the Russian government decided to cheat on that treaty. But it's only one of 9 arms control treaties that they've been cheating on over the last decade and some. And thanks to Michael Gordon when he was with his prior paper, or I guess maybe with his current paper, for breaking that story, because that story had been suppressed for quite some time. So yeah, I mean, it's really important to know that. But I personally don't see a need to match like with like in this particular context.
Now, you mentioned the New START Treaty. It's set to expire on the 5th of February next year, 2021. You recently advocated the United States should propose to extend the current version of New START on a renewable basis to begin or subject to Moscow's acceptance of certain conditions. The first one being that Russia's willingness to begin negotiations on a new treaty would capture all nuclear weapons, which is an important condition. And 2, the U.S. reserving the right to condition continued adherence to New START based on progress made on those negotiations the previous year. Why are these conditions important to include, and why do you believe Russia would be inclined to accept them?
So to begin with, arms control treaties are supposed to constrain the threats that face us and our allies. And when New START was signed, even though it allowed more nuclear weapons than the Moscow Treaty signed by George W. Bush and Putin in 2002, because of the bomber counting rule, the numbers actually were higher. In 2009, 2010, the Russian threat to NATO and to the United States was in fact largely confined to their strategic forces and some smaller number of short-range theater forces. In 2020, that threat has changed dramatically. The Russians have now completely expanded their short and medium-range nuclear forces, not only the INF busting system, but naval and air systems that threaten us and our allies. And of course, we have the whole issue of short-range, low-yield nuclear weapons and the escalate to win doctrine or capability, whatever. It's a capability, even if it's not necessarily in doctrine. So New START doesn't protect our allies. And then you have the exotic systems. You have the intercontinental submarine, the Poseidon system. I guess they call it the Poseidon system. You have the Kinjal nuclear-tipped, air-launched hypersonic system. These are not constrained by the treaty either. So the threat to the U.S. homeland has grown. The threat to our allies has grown. And simply extending a treaty that covers traditional strategic intercontinental systems no longer meets the threat. So if we're going to do arms control, we need to constrain the threat to ourselves and to our allies. That's why I think New START is no longer fit for purpose. I mean, I would extend New START if the Russians would agree to carrying out immediately negotiations on all nuclear weapons. And it's worth noting that when the Senate ratified the New START treaty, it called on the Obama administration to begin negotiations with the Russians on shorter range nuclear systems. The exotics, of course, hadn't appeared in public yet, and so those weren't included in the resolution of ratification. But arms control is not about a piece of paper. It's about constraining real threats to us and our allies. I think that the Russian military and some in Putin's circle are worried about what the United States could fire. I think they are concerned that while their modernization program is nearing its end, ours is just beginning. And the lines at Northrop and at General Dynamics Electric Boat are going to open up. And absent a treaty, we could produce a lot more nuclear systems than they would like us to have. I think that's the basic leverage that we have now over getting Russia to agree something that they have no interest in agreeing to, which is limits on their shorter range and exotic systems, because we have no counterparts.
Right.
That's why I would not simply extend New START, because it gives up the leverage. And for those who, again, have gray hair, we've been in arms control negotiations in the past with the Soviets that lasted for years and years and years while they deployed new systems. Giving a shot clock, if you will, giving a shot clock to the negotiations and saying, we've wasted a year, you're not going anyplace, we're getting out of this, puts some added intensity and pressure on the Russians to come to an agreement. Will that work or not? I don't know. But again, I get back to my fundamental point. The New START treaty, whatever one thought about it back in 2010, is no longer fit for purpose.
Okay, but you're good with, what I take away with that is you're good with a short-term extension while new negotiations continue or are initiated.
Yeah. Sure, as long as negotiations in good faith begin with the goal of capturing all nuclear weapons, I see no reason to cast New START away. But absent agreement to do that, and to do that in a good faith manner, and to do that in a relatively rapid fashion, then I don't think the value of New START is that significant. I would go off and I would start our modernization program, and I would expect at some point the Russian government would come back and say, okay, now let's talk about it. We've seen this movie before. We have honestly seen this movie before in the 80s, and we saw it to some degree in the 90s. And you know, I mean, if that's the price of doing business with people who still have lots of old Soviet ideas in the system, that's the price of doing business.
Thanks, Frank. Now, while there's a great deal of interest in nuclear modernization, and when folks say nuclear modernization, they tend to think about the submarines, the bombers, and the missiles. There's also a critical need to modernize the infrastructure of nuclear command, control, and communications. According to the Nuclear Matters Handbook published by Office of Secretary of Defense, the nuclear command and control system provides the president with the means to authorize the use of nuclear weapons in a crisis and to prevent unauthorized or accidental use. So what are your thoughts about the state of today's nuclear command, control, and communication system, and how it needs to be improved or perhaps even replaced?
Well, I think, first of all, let me say up front, I am not an expert on the command and control systems. But what I do know of it is that we used to have a very, very robust nuclear command and control system, which is supposed to provide the president, the Secretary of Defense, the National Command Authority, reliable, timely, and accurate warning information, and then allow that information to be processed to see whether or not the United States is under attack, and to allow the president to make a decision on how to respond. Over the years, in some large measure due to economies of scale, we have allowed that system to be drawn down. Again, not to make too fine a point of prior years, you and I remember when there was both an Air Force fleet of nuclear command and control aircraft and the Navy fleet, the TACAMO fleet. And
right.
Then back in, I guess it was the 90s, we did away with the Air Force fleet and created just the TACAMO fleet as the airborne warning command and control system. Well, okay, but you got to have new airplanes. You got to have new communications capabilities. You have to worry about cyber intrusion. You have to have a more robust satellite network, because the Russians and Chinese, despite what they say publicly about a treaty to keep space militarily free, have hunter-killer satellites up in orbit. The 747 aircraft with the ELF tail, those are old beasts. You know, yeah, we can keep them flying, but they're not going to fly forever. It's back to Ash Carter's point. At some point, these things are going to have to retire, and you can replace them or you cannot replace them. Nuclear command and control is the backbone of the deterrent. It is the unique thing that makes the system credible, and it's the thing that therefore enemy militaries will try to hobble. We ought not help them by keeping obsolete equipment in the force, and we ought to be using all sorts of new technologies. Not, however, using the World Wide Web, which a retired four-star once tried to do when he was still an active duty four-star.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Frank. And just for the audience, if you may not know, we wrote a paper last year on this subject of nuclear command and control and communications, and that's available on the Mitchell Institute website. It is a topic that not many people are aware, and rightfully so, but they do need to be aware of the points that you raised in the context of hey, you know, we've got 58-year-old bombers that were flying around command and control system. In some aspects, while it's been updated, infrastructure needs to be improved and protected, particularly for the threats, potential cyber threats. Speaking of another area that might need attention is, you know, it's clear that the return of great power competition means that our nuclear forces and command and control are back in focus. Across the decades since the Cold War, however, the reservoir of human resources has dwindled in skilled areas such as nuclear weapons engineering, testing, and development. Some in industry say there's an extremely limited talent pool that may be insufficient for planned modernization initiatives. What's your assessment of the current nuclear weapons talent pool, and what might be done to increase the depth of talent that the nation actually needs?
I think that is a critical shortcoming. It's in part a shortcoming because we, the Clinton and to some degree the George W. Bush administrations, succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. As the Cold War ended, the word came down from on high that if you were a Sovietologist or a sinologist or a nuclear weapons expert in the policy world, or that's what you did as a living at the laboratories, go do something else. There's not going to be any future for you in this profession. And so certainly in the intelligence community and the policy community, people deserted the nuclear world in droves. And I think that is also true in the technical community. The laboratories do not have large, well, I mean, just given the test entries, the numbers of people who've ever designed a weapon that was tested can probably be measured in the very low tens. So we have lost expertise. In the policy community, my personal complaint is that people who used to think about deterrence are gone, and we have people who think about arms control, and that arms control in a very limited and unilateralist context. So I think, again, we need to face the unpleasant truth that whatever the high hopes were after the wall came down and the Soviet Union vanished, we now have two peer competitors, two potential enemies, who rely very heavily on nuclear weapons in their military posture, who rejected President Obama's 2009 call to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in their posture and instead increase the role of nuclear weapons in their posture. We need to understand that. We need to modernize our systems. We need to grow the next generation of scholars and of intelligence analysts and of bomb designers and of aircraft and missile designers, because we cannot sustain the nuclear enterprise based on 70 and 80-year-olds. Not that we're not good.
Well, you know, age is relative, Frank, so
Yep.
you're only as old as you think. And
Right.
we very much appreciate you staying engaged in this critical arena. There really are very few who have your expertise and insight. So thank you very much for that great rundown. The Air Force Association and the Mitchell Institute want to wish you all the best in this era of ever increasing challenges. So
Thanks,
thank
Dave.
you.
Thank you.